of a session that's about a specific subject matter, which I'm very excited about, ransomware. We've never done a panel just about ransomware before, but ransomware attacks have really become data breaches and are rising at an alarming rate. In my opinion, so long as they will continue to grow exponentially. This week, it was reported that TravelX paid $2.3 million a New Year's Eve ransomware attack that crippled the company for weeks and caused Pete to downgrade their debt to junk status. So it's really become a big topic, and we have a great panel to talk about it. First off, my pal Kim Peretti is really a cyber superstar, and I've known her since her time at the Computer Crimes and Intellectual Property section at DOJ, and she now chairs the Cybersecurity Preparedness and Response team at Alston and Bird. She's a real pioneer in our field. She broke new ground, forging a cyber practice that had barely existed until she created it. Kim is one of the several panelists here today who have spoken in my class at Duke Law School over the years. And this year, she not only got great reviews, but one student said simply, "I learned today that I want to be Kim Peretti." That's high praise from any law student anywhere. So great to have a true innovator like Kim who paved her own way. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on ransomware. Welcome, Kim. Our next panelist is LeonardBailey. He's really the Dr. Anthony Fauci of cyber. LeonardBailey defines what it means to be career DOJ, devoting his professional life to keeping us safe, serving too many U.S. presidents to mention, drawing his observations and conclusion from an impressive and remarkable and very special DOJ career. He actually joined CSIPs almost 20 years ago, then left for a stint in DOJ National Security Division in 2009, then returned in 2013 to form CSIP's Cybersecurity Unit as Special Counsel for National Security. While today's panels feature a range of former DOJ CSIP members and NSD lawyers, it's also nice to have LeonardBailey, who's a current lawyer at both of those groups. Welcome, Leonard. There is a photo of you next to the definition of public service in the dictionary. Thanks for dedicating your professional life to keeping us safe, and welcome.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Excellent. Next up is Scott Lindlaw. Many of the more sophisticated IR teams now have a PR expert in the mix, and that's where Scott Lindlaw of Sard Verbinnen would come in. He's really a professional communications expert, but what makes him stand apart from the rest is that he's not an ordinary communication specialist. He was also once a seasoned cyber attorney at Oric, and before that, a veteran AP reporter and White House correspondent with a master's in journalism, who was once even nominated for a Pulitzer. I work on a lot of ransomware matters, especially this past year, where the victim would prefer to keep the situation quiet, especially the ransomware payments. I can't wait to hear Scott's take on this precarious situation. Welcome, Scott, and I hope all is safe and healthy in San Francisco.
Right here. Good morning from San Francisco. Thanks, John.
Excellent. And finally, we have Sean Hoar. We had some technical difficulties. Are you with us, Sean? I think we've still got some technical difficulties with Sean, but we're working on those. And in the meantime, I'm going to talk about how great Sean is, and this is going to be great because he can't respond to it. He's moderating the panel, but I'm going to turn it over to Kim in a second. He's chair of the Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group at Lewis Brisbois. He's more than just an IR lawyer. He's got real technical chops. He's got every cyber certification there is. When he's done advising a client on legal issues involved in a data breach, he can then actually conduct a certified data security audit. And I think he's the only one here today who can do that. He's even founded and served as the executive director of the Financial Crimes and Digital Evidence Foundation, teaching federal investigators about cybercrime, digital forensics, and electronic evidence. So I hope all is okay in Oregon, Sean. I hope we can get your audio fixed. In the meantime, I'm going to kick it over to Kim and have Kim get this panel started, and then I'm going to go and get the next panel ready. Thanks, Kim.
Great. Thanks, John. Appreciate it very much. And as John mentioned, we have a panel this year focused on ransomware as it's been growing exponentially. And just a couple stats out there, it was reported to be a $7.5 billion damages to U.S. companies related to ransomware in 2019. An increase by one cyber insurer and 131% increase from 2018 to 2019 in ransomware attacks. We've seen over 2,000 ransomware complaints in 2019 alone to the FBI IC3, and we've seen a doubling in the average price of ransomware. So that gives you some indication of what we've seen just in the last 12 months. I think we want to kick off the panel with Leonard and have Leonard talk about, from working with federal investigatory agencies, what trends have you seen in the past 6 to 8 months, or 6 to 12 months, in terms of variants and attacker motivations?
Hey, thank you, Kim. I think I'd like to talk about one trend in particular and then break off into just a small discussion of a theme that I think flows through that. So, we know the normal conventional model for ransomware involves someone getting access to a network, encrypting files, and demanding payment for, exchange for a decryption key. One thing that started to occur around January, late last year, was we had groups like Maze, the operators of the Maze ransomware, step forward and say, no longer will you, the victim, have the option simply of either paying us or not paying, and figuring out whether you can recover the system by yourself or rebuild it. Instead, we're going to publish the sensitive information that we have taken from your network. And they've offered even kind of a tiered payment structure where the cost of decrypting the entirety of your system would be one price. The cost of removing your material from being posted would be another. And again, Maze was one of the first groups to do this, but now many others have followed suit. We've got Doppelpayment out there doing the same thing. So Kibby is also doing the same thing. And this new model poses all sorts of new different risks for a victim. One thing I'd like to burrow down though on is that I think it changes our conception of the kind of life cycle of a cyber incident. I think many people viewed a data breach or intrusion as one type of offense, and then a data breach as another. A ransomware attack is another. This instead suggests that these are all in the same cycle of attack, except what you have at the front end is the attacker intruding, moving laterally through the network, finding important documents that you may want to keep, concealed, and then exfiltrating those, and doing all that in a stealthy mode, and then on the way out the door, in a much louder way, launching the ransomware attack. And so this kind of life cycle now of the way in which this is being addressed poses new risks for victims and new ways of thinking about how they should manage that risk. And I think Scott will be talking about some of that in a moment. But one thing I'd like to, though, underscore as a theme to this is that in watching how ransomware has developed over the last several years, kind of really starting kind of to take root in 2014, 2015, I have a slight fear coming from the law enforcement side that we started to talk about it in a somewhat sanitized way, that we talk about the decryption of information and the business model of ransomware attackers and the business decisions that the victim must make. And the one thing I fear we lose in that is the appreciation that what we're really dealing with at the core is extortion. This is an extortion attack that's being conducted by extortionists. And the reason why I think that's important is because I think that should color the way in which a victim approaches both the issue, approaches its dealing with law enforcement, and thinks about how they are going to deal with the attacker. Ultimately, what you're dealing with is an individual who is attempting to gain whatever leverage they can to coerce a company, usually, to do something that's not in their interest, pay them, pay money. And this status as a victim of an attack, an extortion attack, I think sometimes it's getting lost in some of the way that the victims are thinking about what's happened to them.
Thanks, Leonard. And I know we're going to talk more about some of those hard decisions and thinking through the types of attacks and framework around the extortion with respect to it. But just to sort of talk about what we've seen from the private sector standpoint the past 6 to 8 months, it certainly mirrors in trends what you have identified with the data theft, the leakage, the exfiltration of information to try to increase the ransomware amount, but also to sell it on the dark web to maybe have a secondary profit. And we've seen several groups testing the waters, not just the Maze, but now there's 4, 5, 6 other groups that are trying to see if this is going to work for them as well, which certainly has changed the risk equation for all of this. And you had mentioned sort of that, it blurs the, ransomware, the life cycle, that it brings in the data breach component of it. And it's not just ransomware, it's also the data breach. What I would also say, what we've seen from a trend that's very similar to this, but doesn't get quite to the data breach, is the conception of the human-operated ransomware events. Now, years ago, we started off seeing more automated attacks where there would be an attack on a system, sort of crime of opportunity, it hit a system, ransomware is pushed out in automated means, and that's really all the criminals did to the system is have a point of infiltration where the ransomware was then deployed. Certainly, we're seeing the other end of the spectrum with many of the groups not doing the automated attacks, but hands-on keyboard targeted attack into a system, not different from a lot of the state-sponsored attacks that we investigate, the payment card incidents that we investigate. They use sort of low-priority commodity malware to get into the system, like a Dridex and a Motet. And once they're in the system, their goal is to have a persistence mechanism established, a foothold in the environment. So they're running mimikatz. They're trying to get credentials out of memory. They're trying to get elevated credentials to move laterally in the environment, all to identify the critical systems, the backups, encrypt them to increase the ransom amount, and then after days, weeks, or months, to deploy the ransomware to the attack. So all of that says, with the risk exposure here, we're not just talking about automated attacks, criminals not really touching the systems except to launch some process that encrypts data, but it's more than encrypting data. It's getting into the systems. It's having the ability to access files. And now, of course, the latest trend is we've actually seen the results of some groups taking that extra step to actually exfiltrate files in order to change the environment even more and bring together cyber intrusion, data breach, and the ransomware all together. Before we talk more about the risk environment, though, Scott, I think it'd be very helpful to hear what trends or developments you are seeing in ransomware that merit considerations when developing a communications plan.
Yeah, thanks. I'll echo what Leonard said. The single most troubling trend we're seeing in ransomware is Maze and groups like it that out companies that refuse to pay ransoms, that publicly post confidential documents. In any situation, in any crisis, what a company wants is just a little measure of control in what it says and when. Even if you've got a terrible and broad data breach, and you've got a notification requirement to millions of consumers in various states, even if you have to file an 8K, you've got a little bit of control over what you say about the incident, a little bit of control over when you say it. With groups like Maze and ransomware, you've got this third-party criminal network basically pulling the pin on a grenade and rolling it at you at a time of their choosing, in a way of their choosing, outing you as having refused to pay, and worst of all, potentially posting very sensitive confidential documents that they have stolen. We saw this happen just the other day where a small biotech publicly traded company here in the Bay Area had to file an 8K disclosing it was the victim of a ransomware attack. And indeed, the criminals had posted confidential inside information about employees, about go-forward business plans. By the time the 8K came around, the damage was already done. So very troubling trend in the arena of protecting reputation and communications challenges.
When we think about the impact to organizations as a result of this shift or the new trends in ransomware, from a legal perspective, it's really, really significant. Certainly, it has a high probability there will be reporting of the incident, whether it's in an 8K, because there's public exposure of the event, when otherwise many of these events do not need to be publicly reported or can be contained within the organization. They don't need to be publicized in any way. But once you have data that's been exposed, that's on the internet, sold on the dark web, leaked on various sites, you have a very high, if not a certainty that there will be some data breach reporting that's required. And of course, that all is legal risk of the increased public exposure of the event, as you mentioned. And any, cybersecurity events, even though they're so prolific now, once they're disclosed, there's some toxicity around the event itself and having to manage it and manage the reputational impact. There's also, as a result of these trends, the increase in the chance that you're going to be paying a much higher ransom than you otherwise might have had to for these reasons. And then not only the data exfil, the maze type incidents, but the other types of human, organized events that I was talking about, the ransomware, where they're just getting into the systems, they're moving around, not necessarily exfiltrating data. But the problem there is unless there's a full investigation, not just focused on the remediation of the ransomware, there's a heightened risk of that those backdoors are not remediated, that we see those criminals coming back again, either because they have the ransomware that's dormant in the system or because they're coming back and exploiting the systems in a different way. So significant legal risk shift that we're seeing as a result of these trends. Leonard, let's turn it back to you from a national security or national perspective. How can federal law enforcement address how you would assess the trends in terms of the danger to digital environments as a result?
Sure. So I guess I should make a point about what law enforcement's role is in dealing with a ransomware incident or maybe any other cyber incident. By and large, with a cyber incident, you have a company that has basically had maybe the worst day it's ever had, an existential threat. We recognize that one of the things that law enforcement can do is we can at least make what is a bad situation better by providing various types of assistance. So, for example, if you're going to be doing anything kind of preparatory, if you're going to try to deal with, in the context of risk management, an attack, and therefore thinking forward-looking, what should I do and what can I do to help prepare for this problem? That's where some of the comments made earlier during some of the earlier panels come in. I noticed in the chat box there are references to InfraGard and the electronic crimes task forces across the country. In terms of what the government and law enforcement can do in terms of helping a company deal with sort of managing risk, kind of identifying what the threats are and the impact of those threats and helping to trace them. That's where we point to things like InfraGard and the Electronic Crimes Task Force, which are able to provide companies, potential victims, with the sort of cyber threat intelligence technical information that they might be able to use in the event that they do later fall victim to a ransomware attack or other attack. One thing that is axiomatic about information sharing is that the best information sharing occurs within communities of trust among parties that are at least familiar with each other. And as was pointed out in the business compromise panel, the building of those relationships far in advance of the incident are rather critical. And to those who are viewing, who are not members of InfraGard or ECTFs across the country, and there are many of them. There are 79 InfraGard chapters and 40 electronic crimes task forces across the country. There surely is an opportunity to do that and to avail themselves of the ability to get information that will help them do things like manage risk.
I've had many clients tell me that they attended a FBI or a DOJ seminar on ransomware in advance of them being subject to any such incident and said it was incredibly helpful, the information that was provided and how to help navigate the incident in working with law enforcement. And I would echo that when we've worked with clients in the aftermath of an incident, reaching out to the FBI and DOJ has been very valuable in terms of not as much on the investigation side, but on intel, on the threat intel, on the actor itself. And our clients are often surprised, well, what would they be able to tell us about the actor? And are pleasantly surprised when there's a variant that's identified that the FBI is really able to share information on that actor in terms of the volume that they've seen that actor hit other companies and and how they've approached the either paying or not paying or decryption and how, quote, reliable this threat actor may be, even though it's a criminal. So wanted to pass along that feedback from our experience, at least.
Thank you. If I could follow up on one point you made there.
Yeah.
I was speaking of really risk management as an forward-looking situation. Once a company is a victim of something like a ransomware attack, there are other benefits that working with law enforcement can afford. So, for example, cyber threat intelligence that is specific to the victim in the incident, the furnishing of, for example, information about whether the ransomware group you're dealing with is reliable, a group that you have that, based on former investigative conduct, has honored, their agreement with a victim. That's the type of information that law enforcement and FBI has been willing to share with victims. The second thing I'll say, with a huge caveat, which is, this doesn't happen, certainly not always, and it happens relatively rarely, but there are instances in which law enforcement also has a decryption key that can be used to decrypt a victim's material. So, another reason to kind of contact law enforcement.
We wish that would happen more often. that would be beneficial for all of us. I know we're going to turn over to what to do and how to respond, what things you need to be thinking about in the first 24 hours. And I know one of those is certainly, and one of the hardest ones is communications. With ransomware events, it's not like other intrusions where you may have the luxury to work through an investigation to plan out when and how you might communicate about the event. This is in your face immediately. And Scott, what are some unique aspects of communicating about ransomware incidents?
Well, first I'll go back to the question of unique risks. Ransomware, and particularly a maze situation, are one where you've got this incoming unwelcome fire coming at you. You've got a company that's at a minimum struggling to get certain systems up and maybe entirely crippled, along the lines of DLA Piper. Your company's probably negotiating, maybe through a third-party consultant, with the bad guys. You've got these incoming reputation-threatening questions. Did you leave the back door open? Did you invite the attack? Did you somehow not secure your systems adequately? And then on top of that, you've got layers of ransomware-specific questions along the lines of, did you pay? If it becomes public, as Maze is certainly doing and exploiting, did you pay? If so, how much? If not, why not? So I think what's really unique and troubling is that at the moment of the attack, or at a minimum, at the moment it's a Maze-type group, at the moment you decide not to pay, you've got to ask yourself, could we preemptively disclose this ransomware attack if it's not already out there? Should preempt Maze? Should we go out there with an announcement, a press release to do this on our terms? So that's one thing that makes it very difficult. In terms of what to do immediately, we've got a 2-pager. Sard Verbinnen's got a 2-pager that I'd be happy to email anyone who contacts me, kind of a do this now, the first 9 steps. And then kind of a do's and don'ts is page 2. I'd be happy to share it with anyone who's listening and watching today. The first thing to do is to step back and be thoughtful. There's an impulse out there to, immediately start blabbing about what has happened, to over-communicate. More often we see the temptation to under-communicate, to say nothing, to curl up in the ball, not acknowledge it, not respond to the news media. I don't think that's the right course of action either. It's balancing right information, right audience, right time, working closely with people like you, Kim, in terms of getting guidance on what might be required and what's happening along with the technical team. I think very quickly we need to inventory your audiences. Who must I communicate with in this situation, or who might I need to? It's probably some combination of customers, partners, employees, news media. You're keeping an eye on social media, so you quickly catalog who those audiences are, and probably in the first hour or two, if this might go public, and certainly if Maze has outed you, you need a quick holding statement. By that I mean a 2 or 3 sentence statement to be used reactively if you get a media inquiry. And there's always tension around how much to say in those. As I said earlier, some companies want to take a minimalist approach and talk about we've had a technical problem. I would say in this environment, in the ransomware environment we're living in now, saying we are having technical difficulties and sort of papering it over with euphemisms like that is roughly the equivalent of saying an executive left the company to spend more time with his family. A lot of sophisticated audiences are going to hear we're having technical difficulties and just know it's probably ransomware. So balancing what you're going to say in that immediate holding is a tricky balance. It takes experience, it takes judgment. Along the way, you're working alongside outside counsel, in-house counsel, the technical team to match up your statements, public-facing statements to employees, customers, et cetera, with the situation as it's developing. And of course, I'd say one more thing, and that is you want to monitor very closely social media, news media, and the channels that a group like Maze works to make sure you've got situational awareness if and when they do say something. And Kim, I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier and ask you a question. So often the 8K is the communications instrument. In a big data breach, it's basically often a press release wrapped inside an 8K. And I'd just love to get your take on how often you're seeing 8Ks. You mentioned them earlier in the ransomware arena. It seems a little bit inconsistent to us. On the communications side, of course, we care a lot because we cadence our often the entire public communications around when an 8K is coming out. So how often are you seeing 8Ks in ransomware situations?
Haven't done an exhaustive look at it, but not often. And frankly, we don't see 8Ks very often in cyber attacks generally. I think we've seen a trend over the past couple of years to err on the side of an 8K in situations where we wouldn't have normally done that before. So I do wonder if it will change. I do think that the Maze, the data exfiltration, the posting of what happened is a game changer for these types of events. Most of these events, and there's been hundreds, thousands of them, as we know, do not get publicly reported. They're able to sort of work through it, and sometimes quickly, sometimes not as quickly, with the end result being paying, getting the key, decrypt the systems back up and running without too much operational impact. And as a result, there's no need to do any public disclosure of it or 8K filing. It doesn't end up to be that materiality finding met. But I do think that might change with the exposure created by the Maze type ransomware that we're all now likely to be seeing more of. On the comm side, though, I want to pick up something that you said, and we struggle with this in the non-sort of data exfiltration, in the more typical ransomware case we've had, where we don't expect we won't be making any notifications. We don't think that there's been any sort of, quote, access to the data. There's low probability of compromise from a PHI, HIPAA standpoint. We're able to sort of get through the process, pay or not pay, restore systems, restore data, move on with our lives. I think it's really challenging for companies to know what to say, because of course now when you say technical glitch, and we've counseled on technical glitch, and I think that's been more standard early on, you don't want to come out and announce that you've had a cyber attack. It's got that toxicity to it, as well as saying ransomware, because then you'll have all the fallout and the questions from your business partners, from your employees. Well, did you pay? Did you pay? And you will have to side skirt those issues. So I think, I would be interested in your thoughts on it's not likely to be a public incident. It's not likely to be reported. You've got to sort of get through the incident. Your website's going to be down for a while. You're not going to be at full operations. There's going to be a lot of chatter, with the employees. They know already it's a ransomware attack. Can you continue to say something other than we were subject to a ransomware attack?
Yeah, it's a great point, particularly the threshold issue of whether to acknowledge ransomware, because then it does invite those questions. Did you pay? How much? And if not, why not? A threshold question is it visible to the public? I mean, we had a client a few months ago whose computer systems were down, could not service their customers, couldn't even take a phone call in their VoIP-based system. In that case, you probably have to have a little more robust statement acknowledging what happened, and the minimum to your customers. And then you assume that leaks out to the news media. I think you probably want to have in your back pocket at least a statement that acknowledges that you are aware of an incident, an issue, and you're doing everything you can to remediate it. So it's kind of a spectrum, and the spectrum probably hinges on how visible it is to the public and your audiences, and how damaging or problematic the situation is.
Thanks. And for the audience members, I got a nice preview of Scott and his firm's do's and don'ts as far as from the communication side and ransomware incidents. I thought it was very thoughtfully done, and thank you for that. Very, very nice. Nicely done. Let's move on to talk about what to do in the first 24 hours. And many in the audience might have been through this either with their company or with their clients. I think until you go through it, it's really hard. You sort of have a vision of how it might unfold, but it's really important and unique to walk through the crisis event. It's very unique in many instances. And what I want to start with that I often tell companies is one of the firms that does a lot of these as a third-party intermediary put out information that the average downtime for any company, whether they pay or not, is about 16 days, a little bit over 2 weeks. And that's usually where I start when I start preparing with companies to think about what you're going to need to do in the first 24 hours, because there's this idea that you walk into the situation and you make a decision within a couple hours of whether you're going to pay, and then you sort of turn on the light switch and everything's fine. And if you don't pay, maybe it takes a little bit longer. But I really think there's so much more to it. And you have to be prepared for a prolonged period of time where there's going to be an operational impact. And all of these steps that you take, in my experience in the first 24 hours, can impact how long that the whole process, the crisis process continues or not. So I would just go through my short list and then ask for your input. The first thing is, of course, there's going to be some IT people on the ground that are immediately faced with usually identifying a couple systems at a time and seeing something roll out before their eyes, and in a position to take some significant steps that could contain the deployment of the ransomware across the enterprise. Sometimes you catch it too late, but often there's immediate technical measures that could be taken to contain the malware, getting in quickly and seeing maybe what account was used to push it out, what passwords could immediately be changed. And again, we talked earlier on about the trend away from just automated attacks to the human actor attacks, where they're hands-on keyboard, the more manual process. They are getting into systems and they are manually triggering the deployment of the malware, usually through group policy or PS exec. So getting in and seeing this happen, there might be an opportunity to really stop the deployment of it or take some steps that could immediately contain the incident. So that's one, technical response. Number two is immediately being in a position to call in the experts. This isn't something that your company likely has gone through, and it's really one where technical experts are needed, their advice are needed to draw from, and that can be immediately calling outside counsel, getting engaged under privilege to run what could be a very significant event that has a lot of exposure, especially with the potential data exfiltration that we're facing now. Legal engaging forensics. You'll have a forensics firm that needs to investigate. Again, a lot of companies ask, well, why do I need to investigate? I know what happened. I just need to restore my system, get back to work. But what we've seen, again, with the human push out and attacks, the human operated attacks, that there's this time, and often it's more than 3 days, 3 weeks, even 3 months where they're in your systems. You're going to need to investigate that, and your forensics firm is going to be front of the line to help understand the true nature of what happened. Then there's also companies that realize that the forensics firms aren't always the ones that are going to be interfacing with the criminal actors. There's a third-party intermediaries that handle hundreds of ransomware attacks a week. You're going to want a conversation with them as quickly as you can. You want all your doors open. You may not want to pay. You may you may think you don't want to pay. You may think by principle we are not paying criminal actors, but guaranteed when you go through this, you're going to want to leave that door open. And your third-party intermediaries can help provide information on the statistics of these actors. I hate to call them reliable, whether they're reliable or not, criminal actors, but there's lots of information around how they have interfaced, how these criminal actors have behaved with hundreds of companies, and you're going to want that information to factor into your risk analysis. And then it goes to Scott. We have the communication strategy, immediately deciding how, within hours, how you're going to communicate to employees. What are you going to tell them if they can't use their email? Do they need to go home? Do they need to come back to work? So communication strategy, certainly within the first 24 hours. Third-party intermediaries to interact with the criminal actor. I would also certainly put in contacting the FBI or law enforcement to report what's happened. They are going to be extremely appreciative of the indicators of compromise you can provide, of the hash values of whatever files you've discovered. That's very, very valuable to them collectively to investigate, but also you're going to want to pull threat intel from a lot of different sources that will factor into your risk equation. And finally, and probably most importantly, is you're going to need to deploy a team on site, the right team, who can identify whether indeed you have critical systems that are backed up, whether their backups are available or whether the backups were also infected. What is the impact to the organization and how quickly do you think you can recover? Those estimates will always be way off, early on. They're going to be way too conservative. You'll hear within 2 weeks easily, no problem. They will shift, but that's going to be a critical piece to identifying the immediate steps of whether you need to pay, you have to pay, you want to pay, or there's other ways to get through the incident. Stoddard, yeah.
That's really helpful. I'll just add one thought, and it's looking out beyond 24 hours. It's 24 to 72 hours and beyond. And that's the act of listening to customers, listening to investors. I was on the phone this morning with a company that had an incident and it emailed its entire customer base of 17,000 customers, not because it had an obligation to, it probably will under the CCPA, because it was the right thing to do to alert them that their customers might have a problem. So listening to customers, staying in touch, not shooting yourself in the foot over and over in a masochistic way to stay in touch with them for its own sake every hour. But as anxiety rises, you need to be listening to customers. How nervous are they? BioRad, when it had a ransomware attack late last year, its stock fell off a cliff. So you want to be listening to investors, be prepared to engage with your investors, engage with sell-side analysts, and certainly listening very carefully to chatter on social media. It's not that you have to get in and argue or explain with every tweeter who has 6 followers, but it's an early warning system as to the rise of negative and critical chatter. It's a good way to measure sentiment. So the act of listening, I'd say, is a near to midterm and even long-term exercise as well.
And if I could make one point, and then we actually have a question from the audience. The point is, and thank you, Kim, for mentioning law enforcement in that list. We are perhaps more sophisticated than we were many years ago. We don't expect to be the first call after an incident. We like to be, as close to the first call as possible. But we understand that there are a lot of other obligations that companies have to first sort out whether they have any legal obligations attached to the incident that they must immediately deal with. And as you pointed out, I believe, at the threshold, whether this in fact is a malicious incident or a glitch of some sort. And we have put out guidance on how we approach these issues. I think in the materials that were provided for this panel, there's one document that we produced and have updated in 2018, which is best practices for victim response and reporting of cyber incidents, that explains both before, during, and after how we approach an incident and how we would recommend a company do the same. We did get a question from the audience asking what would be the basis for having a Form 8K being required for a ransomware attack, and when would it be required to be filed?
Well, I'm not a securities lawyer, but it would be a question of the impact of the event on the organization and whether it was material to the organization.
And the second question I have is, when should a ransomware attack trigger a breach response? So
it's going to vary per jurisdiction, and certainly if there's PHI, subject to HIPAA, a covered entity, and that information has been encrypted by the ransomware event. you'll need to proceed under the HHS guidance of a security incident and conduct a review to see if there's a low probability of compromise. So there can be, in HIPAA-related incidents, a reporting obligation. Generally, we haven't seen reporting obligations under the state data breach notification statutes. We haven't seen the interpretation that encrypting PII without actually accessing and viewing it is unauthorized access to that data. That analysis, of course, is very different in GDPR land and needs to be approached very differently. But certainly outside of just encrypting the data, if the data is taken and under the control of criminal actors and it's personal information under state or federal statute, that could be a reportable event.
I'll just step back and add my 2 cents very quickly to that. And I'll make the standard plea, the standard call for every company having a breach plan. And hopefully in that cyber incident plan, there's a mechanism for an inbound awareness of a ransomware attack, activating a highly cadenced, disciplined plan that should trigger the legal response, the IT, the technical response, and the communications response as well. Even if it's early days, even if it's the first hour, the wheels should start turning on that internally. How are we going to respond? Do we have notification requirements? How are we talking to these criminals? What, if anything, are we going to say? So writ large, the breach response should be activated, I'd say, Leonard, to that questioner, in the first minutes, the first hour after the company is aware of the attack.
So I think we wanted to end. We're just about on time. We wanted to also talk about, the most important steps a company can take to prepare. I think Scott mentioned the number one we would all have is to have an incident response plan, to have walked through it and tested it in advance and know how you're going to respond. I think particularly for, having the conversation around whether to pay or not to pay, that's very important to walk through with your organization in advance. There's a lot of nuances to it, and you need to be prepared to have that conversation, whether you think at the outset you would never pay a criminal actor. I would also add, as far as key steps, I think we have an opportunity because of the trends we're seeing where the criminal actors are in your system to be able to detect these before the deployment happens. Of course, that's not always easy, but, especially if it's just 24 hours, but we're seeing the expanded time frame of when criminals are in the system rummaging around before they ultimately deploy ransomware. So my 3 would be look for early warning signs in your system. Of course, most critical is to look at your backups of critical systems and data and make sure, if you can, have those backups not be connected to your systems, but have them be offline and be prepared. Now, that can still take several weeks, so know how long it would take to restore the data so you're prepared for the amount of downtime there might be. And then thirdly, again, I think I've mentioned a couple times, it's just to have talked through the conversation of whether you would pay, under what circumstances, and importantly, how, because that how is also a critical important and needs to happen very quickly. How about turning it over to Leonard for some final thoughts on paying or not paying?
Make it quick, though, please.
Yeah.
Very quickly. I think everyone knows that the FBI and DOJ have discouraged people from paying, but with an understanding that there are business reasons why someone would move forward with payment. We would flag that there should be no expectation, though, that in paying, that what you're getting back is a pristine system that will not require any more time or resources or cost. And so they need to make a realistic assessment of whether the cost of payment versus the cost of remediating, how that should be appropriately weighed. And I'll toss it back to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Leonard, and thank you, Kim and Scott. Such an important topic, and great to hear directly from the DOJ here. By the way, the papers mentioned by Scott and Leonard are in the materials. They're very useful. I suggest taking a look at those. The next panel is going to be on another really important topic, which is CCPA and GDPR, and that'll begin at 2:30. So we'll see you in just a minute. Thank you.